There's a sign nailed to a fence outside an abandoned stone house in the mountains above Zadar, Croatia. It's not a no trespassing sign. It's a landmine warning, left over from a war that officially ended almost 30 years ago in a country that's still finding unexploded ordnance in its own hillsides. That house belonged to the Modrić family, and it's been empty for over 20 years, not because they moved up in the world and forgot about it, because they couldn't go back. Not safely, not for a long time. Here's what almost nobody outside Croatia knows about the best midfielder of his generation. Luka Modrić didn't learn to play football on a manicured academy pitch with cones and a coach blowing a whistle. He learned it in a hotel parking lot, concrete under his feet, no grass, no stands. Because by the time he was 6 years old, his family were refugees in their own country, and the hills where they used to live were a war zone. His grandfather, also named Luka, never made it out, killed near that same stone house in 1991 in the opening year of Croatia's war for independence. The family fled with almost nothing to the coastal city of Zadar, where a hotel that used to host tourists had emptied out and started taking in the displaced instead. By the time this story ends, that same 6-year-old boy will be lifting the Ballon d'Or, football's most prestigious individual award, and breaking a run that nobody, not one single player, had broken in 10 straight years. He'll captain a nation of 4 million people to a World Cup final none of them thought possible. And in between all of that, he'll stand trial as a witness in one of the ugliest corruption scandals in Croatian sports history, accused, by his own country, of protecting the very man who helped build his career. This is the journey from a hotel parking lot in a war zone to the summit of world football. Not the highlight reel version, the real one. The rejection that almost ended it before it started. The brutal, unforgiving league in Bosnia where teenagers played against grown men. And the scandal that turned an entire nation against its own captain at the worst possible moment. His grandfather never got to see any of it. Luka Modrić did. And what happened between that parking lot and that trophy stage is the reason people in Croatia still argue, to this day, about who he really is. The war didn't ask Luka Modric's permission to start. In 1991, Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia, and the region around Zadar, including the small village where the Modrić family had lived for generations, fell into the path of Serb paramilitary forces. His grandfather was killed close enough to the house that the family had no illusions about what would happen if they stayed. So they didn't. They ran, with whatever they could carry, and ended up on the coast, in a hotel that had stopped taking guests and started taking the displaced. That hotel parking lot became his stadium. No grass, no coaches watching, no formal training, just concrete, a second-hand ball, and, some days, the sound of shelling close enough that his classes had to hide under their desks until it passed. But here's the thing about a kid who grows up with nothing solid under his feet. Football becomes the one thing that doesn't move. The one thing that's still there every single day, war or no war. By his early teens, Modrić was good enough to try out for Hajduk Split, one of Croatia's 2 biggest clubs, and the kind of move that could have set up his entire career early. They said no. Too small, too fragile looking for professional football, in a sport that, at the time, still prized size and physical presence over almost everything else. For a kid who'd already lost his home and his grandfather to forces bigger than himself, this was one more door closing. But that rejection is exactly what redirected him toward Dinamo Zagreb, Croatia's other giant, after a local coach in Zadar made a call on his behalf, mentioning both his talent and a difficult family situation worth taking a chance on. Zdravko Mamić, the executive who ran Dinamo's youth pipeline through his family's agency, brought him in. It would turn out to be one of the most consequential decisions in Croatian football history, for reasons far beyond what anyone could have predicted at the time. Dinamo wasn't ready to hand a 16-year-old a first-team place, so they did what most Croatian clubs do with promising teenagers. They loaned him out. In 2003, at 18 years old, Modrić was sent to Zrinski Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a league so physically brutal that locals nicknamed it the Butcher's League. Nobody was protecting technical, undersized playmakers there. You either survived the tackles or you didn't play again. Modrić survived. More than survived, he thrived, weaving through players twice his size, getting hacked down constantly, and getting back up every single time. He cramped in nearly every match from giving everything he had on a pitch that offered him no protection. More than once, he had to be carried off, unable to walk under his own power. And still, at the end of that season, Bosnian League voters named him Player of the Year. Even opposing fans applauded him off the pitch. A boy Hajduk Split had rejected for being too small was now too good for grown men in one of Europe's toughest leagues to stop. The following year, Dinamo loaned him again, this time to Inter Zapresic, a modest club in Zagreb's suburbs, fighting for the Croatian title in the first half of the season. He helped drive that unlikely title push so effectively that Dinamo, worried about losing him for good, called him back early. There was suddenly room in Dinamo's own midfield after a controversial, high-profile sale of one of their other prospects to a rival club. Modrić walked back into Zagreb wearing a jersey so oversized it looked comical on his frame, and within a year, nobody was laughing at his size anymore. What had once been his biggest weakness in the eyes of scouts had become the least interesting thing about him. Modrić came back from Bosnia a completely different player, and Dinamo finally trusted him with the responsibility his talent demanded. He repaid that trust with 3 straight Croatian league titles between 2006 and 2008, was named the country's Footballer of the Year, and by the summer of 2008, English clubs were circling. Tottenham Hotspur signed him for a reported £16 million, a huge fee at the time for a Croatian player nobody outside Eastern Europe had really seen play. 4 years later, in 2012, Real Madrid paid roughly double that to bring him to the Bernabeu. By the mid-2010s, the kid from the parking lot was starting Champions League finals, anchoring a midfield that would go on to win the competition 4 times in 5 seasons. But success didn't erase where he came from. It just made the past louder and set the stage for the lowest point of his entire career, one that had nothing to do with anything that happened on a football pitch. In 2015, Zdravko Mamić, the same Dinamo executive who had taken a chance on a broken, displaced teenager over a decade earlier, was arrested and charged with tax evasion and fraud tied to player transfers, including Modric's own move from Dinamo to Tottenham. Prosecutors alleged that a portion of transfer fees, money legally owed to Dinamo, had been diverted through Mamić's agency instead. Modrić was called to testify, as a witness, about the exact terms and dates of the contracts he'd signed as a teenager. Here's where it turned into something far more serious than a footnote in someone else's trial. Under oath, Modrić gave one date for when he'd signed a particular contract clause. In an earlier interview, years before, he'd stated a different date. The discrepancy was enough for Croatian prosecutors to charge him with perjury, a criminal charge against the captain of the national team in the middle of his career's peak. He would eventually be found not guilty. But that verdict came later, much later, and by the time it did, the damage in his home country was already done. Graffiti appeared on the wall outside his old refugee hotel, his name scratched out and replaced with insults. Some supporters and pundits openly called for him to be stripped of the national team captaincy altogether. A man who owed his entire career, his escape from that parking lot, to a family and a system that had taken him in as a broken, displaced kid, was now being painted by a significant part of his own country as a liar who'd protected the people who built their fortune off players just like him. Here's the debate that still splits Croatia today, and it doesn't have a clean answer. Was Modrić a victim of a corrupt football system that used vulnerable teenagers as financial assets before they were old enough to understand the contracts they were signing? Or did he know exactly what he was doing and simply decided loyalty to the man who discovered him mattered more than the whole truth? People who followed Croatian football closely for decades land on both sides of that question, and neither side is short on evidence for their case. What nobody could argue with was what came next. Because while all of this was unfolding in Croatian courtrooms and on Croatian talk shows, Modrić still had a national team to captain, on the biggest stage the sport has to offer, with his own captaincy hanging by a thread the entire time. Croatia had never advanced past the World Cup quarterfinals as an independent nation. In 2018, under a captain still fighting a perjury charge back home, they played 3 consecutive knockout matches that all went to extra time, against Denmark, against host nation Russia, and against England in the semifinal. Modrić, 32 years old by then, covered more distance than almost any other player at the entire tournament. Captain, playmaker, and the emotional engine of the whole run, all at once, match after match, with no rest in between. Croatia reached the final. They lost to France, 4-2, in a match that got away from them early. But Modrić didn't leave Russia empty-handed. He walked away with the Golden Ball, the award given to the single best player of the entire tournament, voted on by journalists who'd watched every team, every match, every alternative candidate. A kid whose 6-year-old refugees rarely get talked about at all had just been named the best player at the biggest event in the sport. Then came the vote that mattered even more. For 10 consecutive years, from 2008 to 2017, the Ballon d'Or, awarded annually to the best footballer on the planet, had gone to exactly 2 men, Lionel Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo. Nobody else had come close in a decade. In December of 2018, it went to Luka Modrić instead, the first outsider to break that duopoly in 10 years, at an age when most midfielders are already talking about retirement, not their first major individual trophy. FIFA named him the world's best men's player that same year. A few months later, in October 2018, the perjury case that had hung over his entire World Cup run finally closed for good. Not guilty on every count. Somewhere in the hills above Zadar, that stone house is still standing, empty. Nobody has lived there in over 20 years. The road leading up to it is barely a road anymore, and there's still a weathered sign nailed to what's left of the fence, warning people not to wander off the path. Landmines, left behind by a war that ended almost 3 decades ago, in a country that is still, to this day, clearing its own countryside of them, field by field. At some point, fans found the house anyway. They nailed a Croatian checkerboard flag to what's left of the wall. Underneath it, in simple handwriting, just 4 words. Thank you, Captain. The boy who learned to play football in a hotel parking lot, because open fields weren't safe, because his country was at war, because his grandfather had already paid the price those hills demanded, grew up to become the best player on the entire planet. Not despite where he came from, because of it. The same stubbornness that got a 6-year-old through grenade drills and hidden desks is the exact stubbornness that got an 18-year-old through Bosnia's most brutal league, and got a 32-year-old through 3 straight extra time matches with a criminal trial hanging over his head the entire time. Next time, we're telling the story of a kid from a fishing village in Senegal who used his first big paycheck from European football to build a hospital back home, before he'd even won a single major trophy of his own. That's Sadio Mane, and where his money actually went will surprise you.